We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. So said President Kennedy. And it seems that President Joe Biden is attempting to deny paternity for the Afghan withdrawal that's being widely condemned as a disaster on just about every scale. Even with his Herculean evacuation effort, he's seen hundreds of Americans and thousands of allies left stranded, yes, stranded, in the country. How can the president come back? And far more importantly, how can America recover? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we have a huge show for you this week, talking Joe Biden, the California recall, Afghanistan, and those two most defining issues of American politics, abortion and the Second Amendment. And while we're here, I'd just like to take a moment to welcome WNWF AM in Evergreen, Alabama, to the Liberty Nation team. Also, remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. We have a packed show coming up here on the Radio America Network, and as ever, we'll be dealing out the analysis straight and clean, minus the spin. This should have been President Biden's finest hour, almost 50 years at the levers of power, culminating the end of a 20-year war. What would have once been considered his crowning moment may now be the metaphorical guillotine that cuts right through the neck of his decade-long building of a legacy. How did it go so wrong for Joe Biden? Well, to figure out the precise steps that led to his snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, we're once again privileged to be joined by Dave Patterson, retired Air Force pilot and the former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, a man who regular listeners will know possesses a boundless knowledge of all things military. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be with you.
So my first question has to be, how did this turn from what should have been a soaring victory into something that has sunk Joe Biden's polling numbers so low that the idea of him running again in 2024, if indeed he's either willing or able to, has become a distant dream for Team Biden?
Well, Mark, I think that starting out, you said what should have been, and I don't think you can use what should have been and President Biden in the same sentence, because that was never going to happen. He does not have, personally, the intellectual capacity to understand what the consequences of what he says are. And secondly, he does not have a staff, team, the national security prowess that would have allowed it to be a victory. And as far as polling numbers go, I think that when they mentioned that to the president, he said, is that in Warsaw or Gdansk?
So, Dave, I want to dig into the specifics of what went wrong here. The evacuation finished, and the president took to the airwaves to announce it all. And he said that his predecessor, Donald Trump, he obviously didn't mention him by name, had made an agreement to pull out on May 1st, suggesting that this would have been too soon and that it would have been reckless to do so. But I don't think that's the case, Dave. As we know, that the Taliban, as everybody within the security services should know, the Taliban, basically all of the Afghan fighters, they have a season for fighting. And this usually runs from spring once the weather permits, and that they have the funds coming in from the opium fields. Now, surely if Biden had stuck to Trump's plan, there wouldn't have been 70,000 plus Taliban fighters in the field, allowing more than enough time for the Afghan government to reposition itself after the U.S. withdrawal. Now, is my analysis here, is it widely off the mark?
No, Mark, I think it's pretty much accurate. I think there are some things, though, that you have to consider in that when you're starting to do hypotheticals. First of all, had Trump's plan started with the election in November of 2020, when it would have started, then he would have had the time between November and May to execute on that plan. The plan was very clear about what was expected from the Taliban. What was expected from the Taliban never materialized. So the deal was off and would have been seen as so by the Trump administration. And then the consequences of what the Taliban began in May would have been airstrikes, considerable amount of damage to what eventually became their advance through Afghanistan. So I think if you're going to make a hypothetical on the one side, you also have to consider it on the other side as well. And a number of things, and I don't want to make this answer too long, but a number of things also. First of all, to have announced that you were going to bring people out starting May, but yet you didn't really do that until somewhere in the middle of July, I think people have to consider that as well. So from the beginning to the very end, this was a botched, bungled exercise, and it's Biden's exercise.
Yeah, let's try and dig into detail a little bit finer here. It seems that Biden, he blames Trump for the debacle of the evacuation. Now, you say that this was Biden's exercise. When if he had done what Trump had initially planned, again, we're getting slightly into the hypotheticals, this mess wouldn't have occurred. Now, is it possible that the Taliban, and to some extent even the former Afghan government, did they suspect that Biden would handle this so badly? And is that why the government, it just seemed to fall as soon as the Taliban were at the Kabul gates?
Well, I think that looking at President Biden's past and the mistakes, and looking at our southern border, I think that it would have been an easy way to think that Biden would botch this as well. I mean, it's not like he doesn't have a history of bungling. And so consequently, someone who would put the faith of their nation in his hands would be truly, truly wrong.
Yes, so some would consider it a reckless move. Now, let's talk about what happens next, Dave. We have varying reports about how many Americans are left in situ, not to mention the thousands of Afghan allies who reports are already suggesting they're being hunted down, executed. They're receiving dark letters or death notices pinned up on their doors. What are the chances that this becomes one of the most, let's call it, significant hostage events of modern history? And if so, what's the goal there? Would it be for more resources or for further American humiliation?
Oh, I think that you're right on the mark. And I think that this is exactly what's going to happen. Now, consider that there is some modest amount of leverage that the United States does have in this hostage situation, and that we have approximately frozen funds, 9.5 to $10 billion worth. And the World Bank and IMF have stopped all aid. And that's going to be significant in terms of how you operate a country, because now you can't make small business loans. You can't do anything in terms of monetary transactions. So that's going to be a significant hurdle for the Taliban. And in a way, it will be somewhat of leverage for the U.S. But do not ever forget that Russia and China will be right there to help. And they may just obviate the entire impact of the sequestration of funds.
Yeah, well, I'd imagine that China, although in many respects, China and Russia are allies on some levels, there is still a very much deeper power play going on here, and one that if they could encourage the humiliation of America through further drawing out hostage situations, which we have seen in the past, works incredibly well at creating an anti-America sentiment or a negative cast over American policy. I think they would be all too willing to join in, and especially if that only costs them a few $1 million here and there. Now, Dave, one final question, if I may, and this is on the weaponry that got left behind. Now, President Trump suggested that it was in the region of $80 billion to $90 billion worth. Now, we've had a lot of national newspapers based out of Washington, for example, suggest that Trump's being hyperbolic with this, and that the real figure is somewhere more in terms of actual gear, close to $27 billion. Now, I got to ask, why do you think this wasn't destroyed? I mean, much of this gear, much of this equipment, it is flammable, it is explosive in nature. Why was it left behind?
Well, I think there are two questions here, actually. And one of them is, what is the truth about the amount of equipment that was left behind. Most of the estimates rely on a GAO report that went from 2003 to 2016 and the amount of material that was provided to the Afghans. Subsequent to 2016, a lot of that has been used up, but the fact is that there were considerable amounts of material left behind. I think that what's useful for the Taliban now is probably much less than people are reporting. They don't have anybody that's going to fly and maintain the Tucano T-29s. They're close air support turboprop aircraft. On the other hand, the Russians and Chinese will be happy to provide that to them. But nonetheless, maintaining a ability and capability to do that sort of thing is not trivial, and it will suck up a lot of money from the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese and Russians will allow for a certain amount of chaos because it suits their purpose. But after that, they'll be far more structured in how they deal with the Taliban. It's whether or not the Taliban will accept the structure. That's the real question. But as far as things left behind, you saw consistently the one picture of the C-130 that's kind of on its side. That's a pretty significant problem to correct, and certainly they don't have the maintenance to do that. But nonetheless, the ammunition and the small arms, that is a big deal, and that's kind of hard to destroy on your way out.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much. Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be tackling the big two, abortion and gun rights, in our special Talking Liberty segment. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with Joe Schaefer to get into the mix on how Joe Biden plans to navigate the stormy waters of his own creation. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.